them to control the entire process. Now, they're not in that risk. They're not in that sort of gamble because they don't have to worry about the bottom price. And their users aren't paying $2-3 an hour, closer to $6 or $7 an hour, because it's like Amazon. It's that full services layer. So to retrofit an ecosystem, it's critical, especially when there are clients and customers, enterprise users that don't want to go to the cloud. They want to keep their data safe with you. They want to run AI where the data lives. The predominant issue has been either you can't handle it, you're not building a facility that can handle it in the future, or you don't have the software layer potentially that can support all of that multi-tenancy. So for what we've seen in the market, for those that have power, right, and what I believe is bravery in the sense of understanding how do I manage the downside risk. Yesterday, Chris Sharp was on the keynote panel, and he said 33,000 H100 GPUs, I think he said, and I had two almost immediate reactions. That is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I'd love to see that. Also, how is he managing that risk? My concern is what happens when whatever that service is, they start to hit that depreciation cycle. And I spoke with the CEO of a very, 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 very large co-location provider, and he stopped. He's like, Bill, we're looking at this at a 6 to 7 year depreciation cycle, and this customer signed on for 7 years. I'm like, that's great, but what happens if their business is completely shattered in 24 months? If they have to completely change the model. And my concern, the risk, is that in the past, where if you lose a couple hundred kW, it's a pain in the butt, you can replace it. If you lose 5 to 10 megawatts from a customer, that's substantially more. So one of the things that we really see is the opportunity here to understand what this market is doing and ultimately go after that inference, not just the model building. I think that's absolutely going to be the case as well, but the people actually doing the use cases. So on our Apollo ecosystem, we have real enterprise customers running real use cases that aren't trying to build the next model that will change the world. They're building actual practical use cases that have ROI in just a few months. Like, they really can show this profit in this process. Take a look at Microsoft. They've spent billions of dollars on their H100 and GPU gear. They haven't shown any revenue for it yet. They're still trying to figure out how to Copilot or how to make Copilot profitable. And right now we're entering into this digestion era of AI, where investors are saying, cool, pump the brakes a little bit on purchasing more H100 gear. Let me see you actually do some work with these. Let me see actually what can you do with this? How can you profit from this? How can you actually show a revenue? And we took a step back and said, we'll develop the use cases, we'll work with enterprises, and we'll simplify the way their business works by picking low-hanging fruit.
So Bill and I have talked a lot about this. This is a good moment to talk about risk. And risk, there is always risk in IT, in technology, in doing new things, but there's also relative. Whenever we talk about risk and bubbles, people always like to talk about the dot-com boom and the dot-com bust. I know Chris is too. One of the folks who saw that firsthand, lived through it in the data center sector, and I think it's important to talk about how risk has changed, what's different, and who's bearing the risk, and how that is a little bit different in this market. In the dot-com boom, you had startups that sold stock to the public, which soared up to hundreds of dollars a share. The members of the public bought this, for their retirement, and so when the initial demand didn't materialize, the startups went under, the stocks crashed, people lost their savings, and then all of the folks who had built all of these data centers were scrambling to try and fill them. And so we had what we talked about as the nuclear winter of the data center sector. A lot was learned then. There are complete changes in how people build and deploy, and most importantly, capitalize data centers. So what's going on right now is it comes in amidst a boom in interest from investors. And what that has meant is that the risk is spread very differently. So for example, you're seeing these enormous data centers, but they're not being, that space isn't being demanded by startups. They're being bought by hyperscale customers who are the largest, most credit-worthy companies on the face of the earth. So what's happening, and this is one of the reasons investors like this model. You see some of the folks like in one of the previous panels this morning that still make the smaller enterprise data centers. The prevailing form factor is huge single-tenant hyperscale data centers that are pre-leased before construction is even finished, which takes all the risk out of the equation for the developers and places it effectively on the hyperscalers and whether or not they are, as Bill says, whether they're going to be able to use all of that capacity. That question will be answered over the life of the lease that may be any number of years. And from the developer perspective, what's the risk there? Well, they have a lease. Microsoft, Google, Meta, and Amazon might not be able to fill that if there is an AI disappointment, which we don't know about yet. There are people using this stuff. If there's a disappointment, it's the rate at which they fill that. They're not going to go out of business. They're almost certainly probably not going to just break the lease. They might have some leverage to renegotiate things, but these are the people who should be bearing the risk in this circumstance. And most of the data center sector now is governed by private capital. The largest investors in the world, like Blackstone buying AirTrunk the other day, are the ones who are doing the investment. So there's no question that there are some components of the system, particularly when you get into the sort of AI as a service, where there's interesting economics and ways things that are being structured that they haven't before. And Bill's got a front row seat for some of that. And we don't know exactly how all of that's going to work out. But I don't know about you, but when I talk to people in the different companies that I work for or work with, they're all finding ways to try and use this. So I think there's absolutely risk, but it's also a very different, when people talk about bubbles, that's a relative thing, and I think this is still very early.
Thank you so much, Rich. The last question is for you.
Okay.
How best can the data center industry and the hyperscalers help utilities to speed grid development?
I think I want to take that in a slightly different direction, because one of the things we haven't talked enough about today is sustainability. And this is something that I've been writing about for a lot of years, starting back in 2007. It's my belief that the digital infrastructure sector, including both the hyperscale customer or the hyperscale users and the data center developers, are going to become the most important players in the transition to a clean economy, both in dealing with the challenges and dealing with the opportunities. The fact of the matter is that the reason we're where we are is that the internet has grown much faster than the power grid or the energy company's ability to create renewable energy and bring it onto the grid. This has been something that we've known we've had to do for a very long time. The energy sector, by and large, has had the science on this for decades, and it's been 9 years since the Paris Agreement. And yet we have reached a point, partly because we don't have enough good green energy, and partly because we've had this boom of AI, where we're facing a critical point here. Dan's right about what the math looks like. Natural gas will play a larger role for a couple of years. But the important thing to remember is that the data center sector, these companies have been on the front lines of the move to try and create a more renewable future. Miranda is here with the iMasons Climate Accord. This is like 100 of the leading companies in the world that have all made commitments to use their infrastructure to try and reduce carbon, create a greener future. Going all the way back to when the first wave of activism was from Greenpeace, and in response to that, data centers used to just try and control the amount of energy they were using in the spaces that they build. That's why we talk about PUE. People have the religious arguments about PUE. It worked. We had a lot of years where there was extraordinary growth of the internet and the energy remained exactly flat. But when Greenpeace came in and said, hey, Facebook, unfriend dirty coal, what happened was folks like Facebook and Google pioneered the power purchase agreements where they would buy a boatload of renewable energy. They'd go to, thinking about additionality. how do we not just like buy a rec for something that already exists? But Google would go and look for somebody who wanted to build a solar farm and say, okay, we'll take all your power, that gives you an agreement and you can take to the bank and finance that. And they've been active players in that. The data center sector, the hyperscalers, have been the largest purchasers of renewable energy for many years now, buying gigawatts of renewable energy. It's a complex environment for them to succeed. They ask for renewable energy. When they talk to Dominion, going back to 2018, 2019, the data center players in Northern Virginia were sending letters saying, hey, listen, give us more renewable energy. We will buy it. That's still the case. And in the meantime, they've used their research labs and innovation to try and think of ways to solve for, frankly, the position we're at now, where we've hit a point where the renewable energy isn't available in the volumes that you'd like, and everybody's scrambling about thinking about how we live up to our commitments and still manage to serve the customers. The good news is that the customers, the hyperscalers, have the strongest ESG commitments and net zero commitments. And so the other thing, they have three things. They have a spirit of innovation. They're working on this stuff in their labs. Things like battery storage, energy storage, geothermal energy, and beginning to deploy some of these solutions. Might take a while to scale. The second thing they have is capital. They've got all kinds of money to be able to bring to bear to solve the solution. If the world really wants AI and they're going to deliver it, then they have the resources to bring to bear on this problem. Third, frankly, they've got the market position. Everybody wants to do business with them when they see that things are going, and that creates leverage. And that's something that they understand. The iMasons are trying to work with and activate that. And that's also true, frankly, of many of the data center developers owned by some of the wealthiest investment firms on earth. Blackstone being just an example of that. So we've reached a point where the rubber has kind of hit the road. And if we're going to have a clean future, the hyperscale players in the data center sector are going to have to sort of try and use a patchwork of whatever technologies and strategies are available to make that happen and see if they can drag the power grid and the energy sector behind along with it.
Thank you, Rich. Very fittingly, you will have the last word at this inaugural Data Center Frontier Trend Summit. If you had questions, you're just going to have to bring them back next year. I want to thank you all for joining us here on the frontier of data centers this week and for being the frontier of data centers. Thank you. And thank you to our clients.